Let's talk about one of the most transformative and controversial figures of the 20th century, Mao Zedong. On one hand, he's the man who founded modern China, unifying a nation after a century of absolute turmoil. But on the other hand, he was a tyrant whose policies led to the deaths of tens of millions of his own people. Today, we're going to try and unpack that complex and brutal legacy.
So which is it? Was he a revolutionary hero who dragged his country into the modern age, or was he a ruthless dictator responsible for almost unimaginable suffering? The thing is, depending on who you talk to, he's one or the other. There's no simple answer, and that's the central conflict we're going to explore. And to really understand the sheer scale of his impact, we have to start with this number, 48 million. That's the estimated number of people who died during the Great Chinese Famine, a catastrophe that was a direct result of his policies. It's a staggering figure that really frames the darker side of his rule right from the start.
So how did one man come to wield so much power? Well, it all started with a rebellious spirit.
From his earliest days, Mao was pushing back against authority. He was born into a pretty well-off farming family, but he wanted nothing to do with the life they had planned for him. At just 13 years old, he refused an arranged marriage. A year later, he completely defied his father and left home to get a high school education. And by 1911, he's a soldier in the revolution to overthrow China's last dynasty. This pattern of rebellion, it would define his entire life.
That rebellious streak pretty quickly found a political outlet, and it set him on a long, brutal path to take control of China.
It's while he was working as a library assistant, of all things, that Mao discovered Marxism. This whole idea that society should have no classes, it really clicked with him. He got deeply involved with early Chinese communists, and in July 1921, he became one of the founding members of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. This party would become his ultimate tool for revolution. But the CCP wasn't the only game in town. They were locked in a huge struggle with the Kuomintang, or KMT, the Nationalist Party. The KMT got its power from the cities, from the landowners. Mao's CCP, though, did something different. He built his base of support among China's massive population of rural peasants, believing they were the true heart of the revolution.
For a short time, they actually formed a shaky alliance. But in 1927, the KMT's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, decided the communists were a threat that had to be wiped out. He turned on them in Shanghai, and his forces killed at least 5,000 people. That betrayal just shattered the alliance and kicked off a civil war that would tear China apart for the next 20 years.
By 1934, Mao's forces were cornered, totally surrounded. Their only option was a desperate, almost suicidal retreat that became known as the Long March. Mao led 100,000 of his followers on this unbelievable 10,000-kilometer trek across China's most brutal terrain. They were under constant attack, they were starving, they were battling disease. By the end of it, only 8,000 had survived. It was a complete catastrophe. But for those who made it, that journey forged this unbreakable loyalty to Mao. The Long March turned him into a legend and cemented his absolute control over the Communist Party. So after years of war, Mao finally seized power. And his grand plans to remake China? Well, they would come at an unimaginable cost. After World War II, the Civil War fired back up, and this time, the Communists came out on top. Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists fled to Taiwan. Then, on October 1st, 1949, Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. In that moment, the course of history changed forever. Then, in 1958, driven by this intense belief that pure revolutionary willpower could conquer any obstacle, Mao launched his most ambitious plan yet, the Great Leap Forward. The goal was just audacious, to rocket China past industrial rivals like Britain and the US in just a handful of years. But the plan was a catastrophe from the very beginning. Private farming? Abolished. Millions of people were forced off their land and into these massive state-run communes. And, crucially, huge numbers of peasants were pulled out of the fields where they grew food and ordered to produce steel in these primitive backyard furnaces. They even had to melt down their own farming tools to try and meet these impossible quotas. The impact was immediate, and it was catastrophic. With fewer people farming and no tools to do it with, food production just fell off a cliff. In some parts of the country, it dropped by as much as 90%. The nation's entire food supply just collapsed. The result was as inevitable as it was horrific.
The Great Leap Forward led directly to the Great Chinese Famine. And this wasn't just a food shortage, it was the single deadliest famine in all of human history. Tens of millions of people starved to death. Now, a disaster of that magnitude weakened Mao's position inside the party. To get his absolute authority back, he was about to unleash another wave of absolute chaos and terror. So by the mid-1960s, Mao had been kind of pushed to the sidelines. Other party leaders were trying to fix the incredible damage he had caused. So in 1966, he struck back. He launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. But let's be clear, this had very little to do with culture. It was a violent, nationwide purge designed to eliminate his rivals and make him a godlike figure once again. He mobilized the youth of China, forming them into these paramilitary groups called the Red Guards. And their target? Something he called the Four Olds. He basically ordered them to destroy anything connected to China's pre-communist history. Ancient temples, priceless art, books, traditions, all of it was targeted for complete eradication. The human cost was immense. Intellectuals, teachers, even party officials who had dared to criticize Mao were publicly humiliated. They were beaten, they were thrown in prison, or they were killed. His main rival, Li Shaoqi, died from mistreatment in prison. Another, Deng Xiaoping, was sent to work in a tractor factory. It was a brutal, terrifying campaign to silence any and all dissent. Mao died in 1976, and he left behind a nation that he had both unified and completely traumatized. So, after all that, how do we even begin to assess his legacy?
It really does come down to two sides of the very same coin. On one side, he's the founder of modern China, no question. He ended what's known as the Century of Humiliation and forged a powerful, new national identity. But then you flip that coin over, and you see the tyrant. The man responsible for more deaths than any other leader in history. The man who destroyed countless priceless cultural treasures and built a totalitarian state based on fear.
Which brings us right back to our central question: revolutionary or dictator? Founder or destroyer? The truth is, he was probably all of those things at once. And so we're left with this final thought, a question that China itself is still grappling with today. How will history ultimately remember Mao Zedong?